Welcome to the first episode of a new series called the Trismegistus Academy. This saga is set within a larger set of stories that I make on this channel called Multiverse Tales and have been making for 4 years or so now, but this first episode is being written as a good inroad for new people to get into it. In this first episode, we follow a brand new original character who will soon enough meet the other existing characters, and their stories together will unfold from there. But whether you're new to my original stories or a longtime fan of Multiverse Tales, I think you're really gonna enjoy this series. So let's finally get into this, shall we? Let's go! Hit like if you want, subscribe if you feel like, but either way, enjoy the show. When Alsaya Laughmani first came to the LAFF, the only thing on her mind was revenge. Now, her only goal was to survive long enough to escape. Because of the mindset she'd been in when one of Headmistress Ludum's scouts had found her, Alsaya had thought the school's gothic, grim aesthetic and focus on teaching its students to be physically powerful at all costs was exactly what she wanted. But Alsaya knew that if her sister, Delilah, were still alive, she'd be doing all she could to get Alsaya away from this place. Her regrets about coming to the academy weighed heavy on her mind during a combat training session against one of her fellow students. Unfortunately, that meant she was about to get an even stronger taste of how cruel the school could be to the students who weren't keeping up. She knew she should have been focusing. Vinda de Mar was someone she could only take when she was on her A-game. Despite running close to 70 miles per hour around the dirt-floored open-air arena to evade Vinda and the two black skeletal fiends she could spawn to fight for her, Alsaya still failed to dodge a fairly simple strike. Vinda had one of her fiends run out into Alsaya's path. She saw it early enough to process and dodge around the foe, but hadn't kept an eye on Vinda, who leapt over and thrust her tail right into Alsaya's path to clothesline her. Alsaya tried to duck, but it was too late. The tail hit her right in the neck. Her legs flung up in front of her, and she hurtled forward while flipping backwards. She rolled across the ground with dirt spraying in her face, until a foot stuck into her back to stop her roll. She rubbed her eyes to see the furious face of her teacher, Kesar Kekuat, staring down at her. "You've been hit 4 times without landing a hit yourself, and now you've ringed out, Laughmani? Pitiful. What's wrong with you?" She glanced up at the other students waiting for their turn on the sidelines. Some looked scared for her, and others were excited by her failure. She jumped up quickly. "Sorry, Mr. Kekuat. I'm just having an off day." "An off day, Immediately after hearing the menacingly cheerful voice of the headmistress, Alsaya's heart started pounding, far faster than it had been from her running. "Do you think when you're off hunting your sister's killer, you'll have the luxury of surviving your off days?" Elloise Ludum continued as she slowly paced past the crowd of students, now all standing at attention. Some were desperate to be noticed by her, and others were desperate not to be. As usual, Headmistress Ludum was in some new, outrageously colorful dress that stood out easily on the black and gray school grounds. Alsaya stood as tall as she could, hoping that Ludum would just let her failure go, but knowing that wouldn't be the case. The smell of hairspray and overwhelming perfume assaulted Alsaya's nose as Ludum walked up to her and put a hand on her shoulder. "Tisk, tisk, Alsaya, you're supposed to be one of my best. We were going to show you off at that silly little Trismegistus Academy tomorrow. Was it a mistake for me to choose you as one of our representatives, Alsaya tried to hide the desperation in her voice. She needed to get to Trismegistus. It could be her only way out of this horrible place. "No, Headmistress. I promise I will do better. I want to show those softies at Trismegistus what a fearsome fighter can really do." She was doing her best to phrase what she said in a way that would appeal most to Ludum, but it still wasn't enough. "Well, you have made me question myself, dear." She leaned closer. "So what will you do to prove you are worthy of representing the prestigious Ludum Academy for Fearsome Fighters?" Alsaya thought to herself, "Please don't say it. Please don't go back out there. You can't escape here if you're dead." But she knew it was the only way. Trying to sound more confident than terrified, Alsaya said, "Put me outside the walls." The students muttered anxiously. Ludum's smile widened. "How long do you think is fitting for you to spend in the Ludul-Lands to prove you are still one of our best?" She wanted it to be as short a time as possible, but didn't want to underdo it. 3 hours. Make it 5, and if you return with no major injuries, I will make you our lead representative. Alsaya knew somewhere in the crowd of her class, Waru was likely disappointed to hear that. Or he wasn't, she had a hard time telling what actually ever bothered him. Regardless, she couldn't worry about him at that moment. She'd been outside the walls once before, and it had been for only 2 hours, but they were the worst 2 hours of her life. She knew students less powerful than her had lasted longer than 5 hours, but that didn't mean she was eager to try it herself. Still, she needed to get to the Trismegistus Academy. She'd never met their teachers or students directly, but she was convinced they were the only people who might be able to help her get away from Ludum and her school. "Alright, 5 hours," she said, choking on her words. Ludum threw her arms into the air. "Splendid! Students, let this spectacular young woman's determination be a lesson to you all. Mark my words, she will go on to be one of the fiercest fighters in the multiverse because of her determination to always push past her limits." Just a few months ago, those words spoken by Ludum would have been a huge point of pride for Alsaya. Now, they just infuriated her. Ludum patted Alsaya on the cheek. "Getting some scrapes may be good to show off what challenges our students survive, but keep your face nice and pretty for me. I have full confidence we'll be showing it off tomorrow." Alsaya stifled a chill. She couldn't believe she'd once looked up to Ludum. The headmistress spun the glowing runes that hovered over her forearm. Seeing that always made Alsaya's heart ache, reminding her of her sister. When Ludum was done, a stone platform with a long control panel, covered in vibrant, colorful buttons, flew down to them, and Alsaya stepped onto it next to the headmistress. Ludum tapped a button on it, and it hovered up off the ground out of the arena. Alsaya glanced back to her class. She saw her friend Waru's face in the crowd, and hoped for some sign of him saying, "Good luck." Instead, he mouthed the words, "You're crazy." "Great, thanks for the encouragement, Waru," she thought as she and Ludum floated up over the school towards the outer walls. The closer they got, the more scared Alsaya became. She could already see some of the laughing Luduls outside the walls pacing and scuttling around. Their wretched laughs, that often sounded more like terrified crying, started echoing up from the vast dead and decaying landscape. As far as Alsaya knew, the only thing on this planet, or maybe even in this universe, was Ludum's Academy. Everything else was the Ludul-Lands. It was a name that didn't reflect how horrifying this place was. They floated down and stopped about 10 feet off the ground, near some jagged hills and trees in a state of permanent decay. Ludum turned to her and put a hand on her shoulder again. "Remember, Alsaya, you're not doing this for me. You're doing this for you, to prove to yourself that nothing can break you. What doesn't kill you only makes you fiercer." Alsaya wanted to shove Ludum off the platform and watch her get torn apart by the monsters that lurked around them. But she knew that wouldn't accomplish anything. Ludum was in control of this world. The only way to be free from her was to escape it. Alsaya just nodded and leapt off the platform. She landed and sprang up quickly, looking around for where the first Ludul may come from. She knew there would be at least one on her in seconds. She pulled up her sleeve to look at her forearm. As was always the case when a student came out here, a light illuminated on her skin, showing her time remaining. The 5-hour countdown had begun. Alsaya heard the horrible cackle of the closest laughing Ludul, but her eyes couldn't find the source. It was getting louder, but she still couldn't see it. The laugh started shifting into a terrible crying shriek. She finally noticed the dirt kicking up on her left side, getting closer. It had to be a Ludul-Lands. She knew she should run away, but the headmistress was still floating above her, and she wanted to do all she could to show she was worthy of coming to represent the academy. Ludum was fickle, and could change her mind at any moment if she thought Alsaya wasn't good enough. She tapped one foot against the ground twice, then did the same with the other. Promptly after, a surge of energy sprung up through her body, like she'd just had 5 shots of espresso. Alsaya ran in a blur in the opposite direction of the invisible creature, then skidded to a stop. She turned back and saw some of the dirt she'd just kicked up being parted by the invisible creature's body as it came after her. She braced for impact, then sprinted right back towards the creature. When she was close, she leapt up and tucked her whole body into a ball, with her right shoulder forward. She felt her body slam into the gangly creature, rolled off it, and landed on her feet in another skid on its other side. As expected, after the creature hit the ground, it promptly became visible. Like most Luduls, it had a wide, smiling mouth that extended past the confines of its head in a way that made little biological sense. It was about 8 feet tall and had bone-thin limbs, along with 2 long, lean tails. It picked itself up quickly and stared at Alsaya. Sickly green tears streamed down its face, but it cackled as it charged towards her again. Alsaya hadn't faced one of these specific creatures the last time she was forced to come out here, but afterwards she'd gone to the school library to thoroughly read a book on every type of Ludul out here. Little Belus could turn invisible, but when hurt, they'd reveal themselves to channel more of their body's strength into their limbs. The creature ran on all fours towards her. She quickly looked around, then sprinted to the side, having found a rock a little larger than her fist. She grabbed it and turned back to run at the creature again, but then a new type of horrid laughter came from below her feet. The rocks beneath her suddenly cracked and transformed into a stone arm and snatched around her leg. She couldn't hold back a scream and dropped her stone as she looked down to see a rocky-skinned little kunakul pulling itself up out of the ground. Its grinning, jagged, stone-toothed mouth thrust towards her leg to bite her. She started rapidly punching it in the head. Thanks to her speed, she was throwing over 30 punches per second, but even with her metal-plated knuckle gloves, she could still feel the skin underneath breaking against the stony creature. It was enough to get the creature off her, and it leapt out of the ground and scampered to the side. But as soon as it did, Alsaya noticed the sound coming up behind her. She whipped around just in time to see the little Belus swinging both its tails at her. She leapt up and tucked into a ball. One tail went over her and one went under. She landed, ducked down, and snatched up her rock again. The little Belus lunged towards her to bite her, and she shoved the rock right into its throat, then yanked her hand back out. The creature collapsed and started choking, struggling to cough up the lodged rock. "Run, run, come on, just run!" Alsaya thought to herself, but she knew Ludum was still watching. The little kunakul was now completely out of the ground, revealing its 8-foot-tall burly stone build. Its hands transformed from claws into boulder fists. It ran past the other Ludul and smacked it in the head as it moved, as though it didn't even notice it was there. It swung its fist at her and Alsaya darted back just out of the strike, then dove under the creature's legs to get behind it. She sprang up and clung to its back. She couldn't hit hard enough to break stone, but luckily, these Luduls weren't very smart. The creature laughed as it swung its own arm back towards her as fast as it could. She leapt off it just in time to miss the fist, and the monster struck itself. There was a loud, clean snap sound. The creature may have had shifting stone flesh, but under all that, there was still a spine. The creature fell to the ground, unable to move its legs, but it still laughed horribly as it collapsed. The other had been unable to dislodge the stone, and was just choking and twitching on the ground. Alsaya took a moment to pant and gather her thoughts, but she barely had a second of relief before she heard more cackling creatures headed her way. She made eye contact with Ludum one more time. The headmistress seemed impressed. Unfortunately, Alsaya knew doing well in the first few minutes didn't guarantee she'd fare well in the remaining hours to come. "Good enough, she's happy with you. Now run!" Alsaya thought before sprinting out of there at 100 miles per hour. She knew she should slow down, but she couldn't stand the idea of getting caught by another Ludul. Alsaya had never actually been able to find the limit to her speed, since her late sister gave her these powers. She figured she may be able to go as fast as 300 miles per hour, maybe even more. But her mind couldn't process information at the same super speeds her body could move at. Her durability was better than the average person's, but not by enough to save her from a bad crash at high speeds. After a few minutes of running out to high ground on a mountain ledge, she paused, hoping to have a minute to think, but knowing that was unlikely. Outside the school walls, the horrible creatures, referred to as the Laughing Luduls, were constantly looking for things to kill. These monsters should have been a red flag to Alsaya far earlier in her time here. They had been made by Elloise Ludum herself and specifically existed to test students in trials of survival and punish students who weren't proving their worth. However, Alsaya now realized they also prevented students from ever trying to escape. After only resting on that ledge for 30 seconds, Alsaya heard another approaching wave of laughter. She looked up to see a swarm of eagle-sized cackling creatures dive-bombing towards her. She looked out across the landscape and saw a forested area. She could escape these flying Luduls in there, but knew there was worse lurking in those trees. Still, at least it was something she could do. She started running slowly down the mountain, then sped up when the ground flattened out, knowing she could outpace these creatures easily enough in a clear stretch. As she ran, hearing the horrible laughter behind her, she tried to distract herself with what little she knew about the Trismegistus Academy. She'd never been to the school that Elloise Ludum spoke so lowly of, but in her head, Alsaya had made it out to be a paradise. Even if it didn't end up being quite what she thought, it had to be far better than Ludum's own academy. She also held on to hope that they could teach her how to track down her sister's killer, like Ludum had promised to do. 5 years ago, Alsaya Laughmani had spontaneously woken up with mysterious abilities that allowed her to manipulate the weather, create living creatures, and even grant other people superhuman powers, all controlled by glowing runes on her forearm. The only information she had on where these incredible abilities had come from was written on a sloppily scribbled note next to her when she awoke that day, which read, "You're a far better person than I was. Please, do better than I did with these gifts." Delilah had no idea who had written the note or given her these powers, but in very short time she started doing incredible things with them. She used the powers to end droughts, snuff out hurricanes, and even use the influence she gained as a hero to guide peace negotiations between warring nations. While Delilah wouldn't take the credit she was due, she quickly became considered the greatest symbol of peace and hope in her world. Until the day she was called to another realm. Delilah told Alsaya that she'd telepathically gotten a strange summons to another universe because of her gifts. That was the first time she'd ever even heard about other universes existing, let alone learned that her powers allowed her to travel to them. But despite her confusion, Delilah was always willing to help whoever needed her. She used her powers to transport herself, alone, to this other realm, only to return hours later with her body so badly torn apart that she barely survived long enough to say a short, painful goodbye to Alsaya. Most of what she said in her final moments was encouragement for Alsaya to live a good life without her. But those weren't the words that stuck with her most. The words that haunted Alsaya to this day were the first thing Delilah had said upon returning in that battered and beaten form. She said, "It was a trap." Deep down, Alsaya knew her endlessly kind and giving sister wouldn't have wanted Alsaya to seek vengeance on whoever killed her, but she felt she couldn't help herself. Her sister had been the greatest hero her world had ever known, and someone from another realm had trapped and killed her in cold blood. In her grief, Alsaya couldn't let that go. Alsaya's world was horrified to learn of Delilah's death and wanted to know what had happened. Devastated, Alsaya did her best to tell the story, and was met with rage for the tale. Her world didn't have any means for interdimensional travel, or even know that it was possible, so many claimed Alsaya's story about how her sister had died was a lie. Now, not only was Alsaya in mourning, but people claimed that she was hiding what had really happened. People relentlessly called on her for a real explanation, to a point where Alsaya just wanted to run away from her world altogether. It was infuriating. Alsaya's period of grieving became all the more difficult due to nobody believing her about what had happened. Soon, all she had to hold on to was the hatred for whoever had killed her sister and the desperation to know why. Thankfully, or maybe unfortunately, Alsaya would soon be given hope that she may be able to track this person down. A short, plucky man in a futuristic sci-fi-like spacesuit and jetpack found Alsaya and asked if she'd been related to her world's overseer. Alsaya didn't know what that meant and just wanted to be left alone, but he got her attention when he asked, "Look, I just need to know if you have a family member with glowing things on her arm that was recently called to another dimension to die." Alsaya immediately demanded to know what this guy knew about her sister's death. In an annoyingly chipper voice that sounded like he was trying too hard to be cheerful, he said that his name was Scout the Scout, and if Alsaya wanted revenge on her sister's killer, she should come with him to meet his boss. Alsaya should have been wary of being called to another dimension by a stranger after what had happened to Delilah, but If there was any hope that this scout guy or his boss could help her find out who'd killed Delilah, then she couldn't resist going with him. Scout teleported himself and Alsaya to the dimension, apparently labeled Z009. This was where she first saw Ludum's massive and isolated school. It was also where she was introduced to Elloise Ludum, and immediately noticed that the headmistress had almost the exact same glowing runes on her arm that Delilah had once had.
"These are the mark of the Overseer, the most incredible beings in all the multiverse. It is our sworn duty to protect our realms from harm. But clearly someone was not eager for us to do our good work. Recently a madman murdered thousands of us Overseers, including, it seems, your poor sister. While my students are being trained for various purposes, I do intend to eventually send a group of them after the vile man who killed the Overseers. So, how determined are you to see him brought to justice firsthand,
Alsaya instantly agreed to attend the academy, finally feeling she had some purpose and some hope that she could actually get her revenge. In her first months at the Ludum Academy for Fiersome Fighters, Alsaya quickly became one of Ludum's favorite students. Her determination had driven her to work harder than almost anybody else at improving her skills with her powers and her fighting prowess. Unfortunately, the longer she was there, the more Alsaya saw how cruel the school's teachers and the headmistress herself could be. She saw students beaten for performing the poorest on tests, and some even killed in challenges against other students. She also heard stories of how horrible it was to be sent out into the Ludul-Lands, and how even those who survived, in some cases, never recovered psychologically. Ludum claimed this was all done in the name of building resilience, and if someone couldn't push through and become stronger through these struggles, then there was no hope for them anyhow, and death was a mercy to them. 3 months in, Alsaya wanted out, and wasn't sure she could trust Ludum to just send her home. She ended up seeking out Scout the Scout, who seemed like a pretty kind person. She tried asking him if he could just take her home. When she admitted to wanting to leave the school, he seemed incredibly excited. Unfortunately, this was because he was all too eager to have someone to rat out to Ludum. Alsaya was promptly taken to Ludum's office, where the disappointed headmistress said to her,
"My dear, I thought so much better of you. I am here to help you, to push you to be the best that you could ever be. You need me. You don't have the discipline to push yourself the way you will be pushed here. I am doing this all for you, so you can finally get the revenge you deserve. Don't you want that? Someday you will thank me for all of this. Send her to the Ludul-Lands."
That was the first time she was sent out to face the horrible Luduls and barely survived the encounter. When she returned, clinging to life, Ludum told her,
"You will only become stronger because of what you've survived today. Remember that, my dear. Now get back to class."
That was when it finally sank in. Alsaya was trapped in this place. All the students were. After that, she kept quiet about wanting to leave, but started looking for any way to escape. Unfortunately, Alsaya had no idea how to travel between universes without the help of Ludum, one of the other teachers, or Ludum's many scouts, who regularly brought in new students. She also started to do some investigating into Ludum herself, spying on her when she was having private conversations with other teachers or the rare people who came to visit from other realms. She managed to listen in on some conversations with faculty from a place called the Trismegistus Academy for Heroic Enlightenment. The first time had been when a stern, muscular, bald black man with what looked like mechanical knees was being led around the school by Ludum. Alsaya had managed to trail behind them close enough to listen in for a while. Ludum had been trying to convince the man to leave the Trismegistus Academy and come teach at her school. The man seemed like he had the demeanor of someone who would teach here, but when he saw how the students were being treated, he practically bit Ludum's head off.
"You think I'd ever teach at a place where you torture kids? I'd sooner lead Trismegistus students here to take you out and every so-called teacher you got here. You're a monster, Ludum."
"Oh, please, Strone. How is what I'm doing any different from what you do? We're both teaching our students to push past their limits and become stronger, aren't we?"
Don't ever lump me in with you, Ludum. I teach kids to push themselves, but they can rest and recover when they need to. And if they really can't hack it, at least our kids have the free will to leave. You force kids to do things you know some of them won't survive. I may be tough, but I'm helping kids and you're killing them. The Trismegistus Academy may be softer than I like, but at least they care about all the kids that go there. We're there to help them. You're only out to help yourself by making a bunch of killers to cause chaos.
Alsaya wasn't able to follow them much longer after that, but it was the first time she'd heard of the Trismegistus Academy, and it already sounded 100 times better than Ludum's school. A few weeks later, Alsaya was able to overhear a conversation in Ludum's office as she spoke to a tall woman with a long bird-beaked face. The woman was Evangeline Trismegistus, and she was the headmistress of the competing school. She was trying to convince Eloise to go easier on her students, or just outright let them leave.
Oh, Evangeline, this isn't a prison. My students can walk right out the door whenever they want.
The visiting woman's voice was so calm and soothing it almost made Alsaya want to cry.
Eloise, be reasonable. These are children. I know your morals have never aligned with mine, but you must see that this is taking things too far. I know you needed something else to do with this realm after many of the multiverse's overseers were killed, but surely this cannot be what you see as a valuable use of your gifts. These children deserve to develop their strengths in a place where they can also feel safe and loved.
Beyond the woman's soothing voice, the mention of overseers caught Alsaya's attention. That was what Ludum had called herself and Delilah. Maybe Evangeline Trismegistus knew the identity of the man who'd killed Alsaya's sister as well. Maybe Alsaya didn't need Ludum's help or information at all.
Oh, you and your precious simple mind, Evangeline. Strength cannot be forged while you feel safe and loved. It is forged in fire. That is why your students will never measure up to the strength of the ones I'm training here. But if you do want to try and prove otherwise, we could always let our kiddies have a little fun together.
It was announced soon after that students from the Ludum Academy for Fiersome Fighters were going to have a series of competitions against the Trismegistus Academy for Heroic Enlightenment. Alsaya didn't care about that. Even if the Trismegistus Academy wasn't as effective at training her to fight, it still had to be better than this place. Alsaya knew her sister would want her to develop her abilities further to help people, but not in a place where she was trapped and terrified for her life. As soon as she could get the cruel headmistress to take her to the Trismegistus Academy under the guise of representing the school, Alsaya was going to run away from Ludum, straight into the protective embrace of this far more peaceful school. The thoughts of this other school had successfully distracted Alsaya until she got into the woods. Once there, she had to significantly slow down to make sure she didn't run into any trees. The flying little quaile stopped following her as soon as she entered, but she knew some of the trees in here weren't actually trees, and that a whole array of horrible Luduls were waiting to attack her. After a few minutes, she started getting chased by a panther-like Ludul, soon followed by a burly bear-like beast. She did her best to just keep running. She eventually left the forest and made rest stops near the foul-smelling Lake Sulphur, then to the Cackler Canyon, and eventually back to where she started. The entire time she was fighting for her life and growing more and more exhausted. She had incredible endurance, but after a few hours of running and fighting for her life, that endurance was dwindling to little more than fumes. Still, she kept going. This could be the last time she ever had to face one of Ludum's sadistic challenges if she just lived long enough to get out of there. She didn't get any big injuries, but plenty of Luduls managed to get hits on her and cut her up. In the last hour, she was also tired enough to be less wary of where she was stepping. She fell over mid-run half a dozen times, and each time her body got more and more beat up. Near the end, she ached all over and just wanted to give up. But before she could actually start considering that, she saw that, thankfully, there were only 5 minutes left. She didn't head straight for the drawbridge that would lower over the bubbling moat around the school to let her back in. She learned last time that the creatures lurking in the waters of the moat were some of the fiercest out there. Somehow those last 5 minutes felt as long as her entire time in the Ludul-Lands. She wondered if Ludum was slowing down the remaining countdown just to torture her. With 1 minute left, she finally ran for the drawbridge. Her vision started to skew. She slowed down, seeing that loose rocks were scattered all across the route up to the moat. She didn't remember that being there last time. She assumed Ludum had scattered them there to make sure she'd have to slow down. Alsaya did slow ever so briefly, before she heard a horrible rumbling laugh from behind her. She didn't have to look back to know it was the dreaded Ludul-Lands. She sped back up and just did her best to look ahead at where her feet needed to step far enough in advance. The drawbridge was slowly lowering, and Alsaya could see Ludum and a dozen or so other students standing inside the doors. Most of them looked up at the sky behind her. Some cheered, and some yelled for her to run faster. She picked up the pace even more, going nearly 80 miles per hour. The drawbridge finally hit the ground as she heard the horrible laughter almost directly behind her. She picked it up even more, but as soon as she did, her foot stomped awkwardly on the edge of a stone. She flopped to the ground and rolled. Stones and ground pummeled her as she tumbled forward onto the drawbridge. She got a few feet from the door and, despite her ankle feeling like it had been shattered in the fall, she scrambled on her hands and feet to the entrance, diving through the door. She dropped to the ground on her stomach, hearing the horrible beast shriek once more as it flew up over the school and retreated back to the Ludul-Lands. Alsaya couldn't care about how she looked in that moment. She was too exhausted and sore. An uncomfortably soft hand patted her on the shoulder. "Well done, Alsaya. Get that ankle looked at and get a good night's rest. We're going to show you off at that school for softies tomorrow." In her head, Alsaya added, "And then I'll never have to see your horrible face again. At least until the day I hunt you down and wipe that stupid smile off you forever." Her sister's killer wasn't the only person she wanted revenge on now. Alsaya just hoped that the Trismegistus Academy was half as incredible as she was making it out to be in her head. If they couldn't help her, she had no idea who could.
Alright, so technically we didn't actually get to the Trismegistus Academy this episode, but we will next episode. I'm trying to not rush myself. I mean, I don't really have to now that I'm doing longer running series, which feels very nice. But don't worry, Jake, Anna, Niseko, and all the other Trismegistus Academy characters are going to be worked in very soon. If you are new to this channel and you want to know more about Multiverse Tales, you could jump in at Multiverse Tales Explained in the Multiverse Tales playlist, and then watch through episodes from there. Or you could go all the way back to the beginning of Multiverse Tales. Or maybe you want to watch some of my other more recent series I've been doing on here, like Vigilance. Starseed Psyche is some of my best writing yet. Mytholethal is super fun and is more action mythology kind of comedy focused. Got lots of good long running series going right now. Also, don't worry, I haven't forgotten about getting Vigilance done as a book or Mytholethal. I'm just still trying to find a good proofreader to go through them before I can finalize them as books to release. But anyway, besides that, that's all for today, except of course for ending this video on some kind of positive or inspiring note. And the thought I want to leave people with today is a quote I've heard before and have probably used in an ending note, but I reread it this week and I really like it, which is that people's reactions to you and your work is generally a reflection of how they feel about themselves. And this, in context for other artists and writers out there, means that if someone is coming to your work and attacking it and saying it's awful or terrible or whatever, there's a very good chance that's a person that's just scared to put their own work out there. And you should try reframing it as a compliment for the fact that you have put the effort in to make your work and put it out into the world, knowing that it may get criticized, but also knowing that the more you do that, the better you get at whatever your work is. I hope that's inspiring. I love you all, and I'll see you all in the next episode on Friday. Goodbye.